Hey everyone, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be a fun show. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Got a few things to talk about with y'all tonight. I'm here to answer your questions in the second half of the show. I'm here to just relax with you. Wish you all merry holiday season, all of that. So welcome everybody. Let's roll right into it. Let's jump right into what we're doing tonight.
I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everyone. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. It's going to be a great chat this evening. So glad to have you all here. Just a few things to go over. The way we do this is I give my opening remarks. My opening remarks are then followed by the roll call. And during the roll call, I call everyone out as I see them, names and locations. And then after that, I answer super chat questions for the rest of the night. So if there's something you'd like me to talk about in the second half of the show, shoot me a super chat. Now, a few quick business announcements. First things first, we will be having our first patrons-only stream of the year, and that will be on January 2nd, Monday. So if you would like to be part of that, all you have to do is become a Patreon subscriber. Sign up on the Patreon, and then you can be part of the patrons-only stream. And the patrons-only streams are very small and intimate. We're doing a lot more of them now than we used to. I think we've done 3 this month, and this will be a good one. So sign up on Patreon. Always good to have you. And that's coming up. The other thing, the Center for Political Innovation, an educational think tank dedicated to socialism and anti-imperialism. We are in business. We're functioning. We're having regular Zooms. We're getting ready for a big event on March 25th. Details to be announced soon. So if you want to be part of our operations, by all means, become a dues-paying member of the Center for Political Innovation. Sign up and join. You can be part of our Zoom meetings. You can get, inside activities. We're doing, speaking training, teaching people about how to give classes, and we're doing good stuff, right? And we got all kinds of people doing good stuff to keep our organization rolling ahead. So if you want to be part of the Center for Political Innovation, go ahead and sign up. So those are the 2 business announcements. And I guess, like I said before, super chats come in with questions. I write them down and then I answer them in the second half of our show. That's how we do it. In the second half of our show, I answer them. And so I'll be writing them down. First half of the show is me giving my opening remarks. Then we do the roll call, and then I go on to answer super chat questions. So if you have something you want me to talk about, shoot me a super chat. There you go. All right, folks, welcome. So I thought for my opening remarks tonight, I would just kind of explain where our movement is going and what it is we'd like to achieve in this time. But in order to do that, I have to explain what our movement is, because there's absolutely so much confusion. I'm at the point where I almost don't want to tell people I'm a communist anymore, because when I said I was a communist, people would say, oh, how could anyone be such a thing? Lenin and Stalin were evil, and they would ask me questions and I could explain it. But now, oh no. Now, if you say you're a communist or a socialist or a Marxist, people get this image of a transgender teenager whose politics consists of, I think Republicans are Nazis, and I don't want people to think I'm that. I'm not that, right? I do consider myself to come from a very serious tradition of a very serious, well thought out ideology. That's what I want to share with the world. And so in order to do that, we have to get clarity on what that is, because no one seems to really have any understanding of what that is. Well, back in 1848, Marx and Engels composed a document called the Communist Manifesto. And in that document, they said that history is marching forward. There's something called historical progress. History is marching forward. It's driven forward by human creativity and our ability to continue perfecting the means of production, the mode of production, reaching higher planes of technology that were advanced from hunter-gatherer civilization, which was communal and tribal. And from there, we entered slavery and feudalism. And then out of slavery and feudalism emerged modern capitalism. And the idea was that under capitalism, there are two classes. There are those who own the major centers of economic power, the factories, the big box stores, the oil wells, the coal mines, the banks, etc. And then there's the rest of us, the wage workers, those who sell our labor power. And that under capitalism, there's a constant struggle between the working class and the capitalist class. And that in order to overcome the problems of capitalism, it was necessary for the working class to seize control of the political power and establish a working class government. And that this working class government would force the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power to function for the good of society, so that growth and human progress was no longer held back and restrained. And as a result, we could move toward a world with so much wealth and abundance that inequality and social hierarchies, the need for the state itself, would fade away. And we could move toward the ultimate goal of, from each according to their own ability to each according to their needs. The problem with capitalism, as Marx and Engels explained it, is that under capitalism, the more wealth that's produced, the poorer people get. Under capitalism, people are homeless, not because there's not enough housing, but because there is too much housing. People are hungry because there is too much food. There's the coal miner's riddle. The coal miner, his son says to him, "Father, why is it so cold?" Father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine, and I can't afford any coal to heat the stove." And the boy says, "Father, why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there is too much coal." That's the problem of capitalism. Under a rational society, self-driving cars would be a great breakthrough. Self-driving cars would mean that the labor of people that drive for a living, taxi drivers, truck drivers, etc., would be gotten rid of. And that human labor could be spent elsewhere, and we could have a more productive society. But under capitalism, self-driving cars would be a disaster, and millions of people would lose their jobs. Capitalism is irrational, and it holds back human progress. It creates poverty amid abundance, poverty amid plenty. And the only way to overcome these built-in problems of capitalism is to move toward socialism and to have a society where profits are no longer in command. Capitalism is the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market. It is a society where the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Socialism is the alternative to that. Socialism is when the means of production, the centers of economic power, work for the good of the people. And therefore, the wealth of society continues to prosper. People are raised up out of poverty. Scarcity and inequality are eliminated as we move toward a society of vast abundance. That is what our movement stands for. However, we know that Marx and Engels started this movement in 1848, the scientific socialist movement. It said socialism would come as a result of the class struggle between the workers and the capitalists. And they meant for it to be a revolutionary movement of the workers rising up and seizing control of the means of production. But after Marx and Engels died, there started to be big changes in the global economy, and that the Western capitalist corporations began spreading their tentacles across the planet, colonizing Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And that in order to do so, the socialist movement became useful because they needed to have the loyalty of the workers at home. They needed the workers at home to be their foot soldiers. They needed the workers at home to be loyal to the empire. They needed the workers at home to not be going on strike and causing instability. And the labor movement and the social democratic parties that came out of what Marx and Engels started, while they originated as a revolutionary movement to bring down capitalism, they became hijacked as a method for stabilizing capitalism and making capitalism and the homelands of imperialism more stable so they could enable Western capitalism to spread across the planet. And that socialism and social democracy degenerated into social imperialism. And that the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the British Labour Party and so many of the revolutionary groups deteriorated and stopped being revolutionary groups and became reformist groups that helped the imperialists stabilize their system to carry out imperialism. And that there became a layer of workers in the Western countries that got some of the spoils of imperialism. They became what was known as the aristocracy of labor. And so because of that, we understand that a new movement came into existence called Bolshevism, and that Lenin in Russia said, Marx, you were right about the problems of capitalism. You were right about the worker and the capitalist. You were right about history marching forward. However, you didn't predict the rise of imperialism. And because of the rise of imperialism, your movement that you started, Marx, it started out as a good working class movement, but now it's deteriorated into social imperialism. And you'd allowed World War I to happen and 20 million workers to go to their deaths. And as a result of that, the revolutionary energy that you thought, Marx, was going to be in Germany and France and Belgium and Britain, that revolutionary energy has gone eastward. And that revolutionary energy is now in Europe. It's now in Russia, and it's in China, and it's in South America, and it's in Africa, and it's in Asia. And that the winds of global revolution are going to be in the East. And that, Marx, you said that all nationalism was bad, but actually it'll be the nationalism of countries around the world trying to break free from the domination of the imperialists. That's what's going to give birth to socialism. Because only socialism will be able to free these countries from the domination of Western capitalism. If they break free from the control of British bankers and American bankers and German bankers and French bankers, if they start to control their own economies, they're going to have socialism, and they're going to have to move towards socialism. So socialism went from being a Western movement fighting for the Western workers, and it became an Eastern movement, a movement of the people of the colonized world fighting for their national liberation. And Lenin developed the party of new type, a new type of organizing, a vanguard party that wasn't a debating society, wasn't a liberal free-for-all, but was a highly disciplined organization, kind of a secret society intended to carry out a revolutionary conspiracy and seize control of the government. And Lenin developed all kinds of new methods, etc. And ultimately, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 brought socialism into existence. And it wasn't from classical Marxism and social democracy that socialism came into the world, but rather from Bolshevism, from a step eastward, from a deviation, if you will, a deviation from the Marxist movement, a radical anti-imperialist, specifically non-Western Eurasian interpretation of Marxism created the Soviet Union. And after Lenin died, Stalin and Trotsky were two leaders of the Bolshevik movement that had a division. And Trotsky wanted to hold on to the Eurocentrism of Marxism. He wanted to hold on to the idea that the only point of the Bolshevik Revolution was to spread communism into the West. But Stalin, on the other hand, he said, no, we need to focus on building the Soviet Union up into a strong country. We need to have socialism in one country. And Stalin defeated Trotsky, and Trotsky got booted out of the Soviet Union. And then Stalin began building up the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had economic miracles, and it electrified itself, and it built some of the biggest hydroelectric power plants in the world, and it built a modern steel industry. And while the rest of the planet was having a Great Depression, the Soviet Union was lifting its people out of poverty, industrializing, wiping out illiteracy, electrifying the country, building modern modern housing units. I mean, it was doing amazing things. The Soviet Union was having real economic miracles. And when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviet people heroically battled against them, defeated the Nazis, and after that, they rebuilt the country again, and then they conquered outer space, and they invented space travel, and they patented the first cellular phone. The first mobile phone was patented in the Soviet Union in 1957, and that socialism became a vehicle for not just the Soviet Union, but eventually China, eventually many Middle Eastern countries, many African countries, even countries in Latin America like Cuba, to industrialize. And when countries broke out of the dominance of Western capitalism, they began moving towards socialism. And it was socialism that built the first, the biggest hydroelectrical power plant in Egypt and brought electricity to all of Egypt. Abdel Nasser, the founder of Arab socialism in Egypt, teamed up with the Soviet Union. They built the Great Aswan Dam, and Egypt was electrified. And it was in Libya under the leadership of a pro-Soviet socialist. He called himself an Islamic socialist. He was a good friend of Fidel Castro named Muammar Gaddafi. They built the world's largest irrigation system. And China, with socialism with Chinese characteristics, has raised millions of people out of poverty. And these countries that broke out of Western capitalism and adopted socialism as their method for raising their people up, they haven't been touched by this crazy Western economic crisis. They don't have the problem of poverty amid plenty. The computer revolution doesn't wreck their economy the way it's wrecking our economy. Under a socialist society where the government controls the means of production, and the government is not simply a front for the rich people, but it's based in communities, and it represents a well-organized population, socialism has shown that it can turn China from being one of the poorest countries in the world into a superpower. It could create Libya as having the highest life expectancy on the African continent. It can create a situation where Nicaragua is heads and shoulders above Honduras and Guatemala, the U.S.-backed regimes of Central America. Socialism under Evo Morales in Bolivia had the highest rate of GDP growth in Latin America. Vietnam, under the leadership of the Communist Party, has had what the World Economic Forum calls an economic miracle. Read what they've written about Vietnam's economic miracle and how this socialist-oriented market economy of Vietnam, the amazing things that it's done. Socialism, and this form of socialism that wasn't the classic Marx and Engels socialism, but it wasn't fascism either. It was a new innovation. It was what started with Bolshevism and has continued evolving and adapting, moving into the 21st century. We see it in Ba'athist Arab socialism in the Middle East. We see it in Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Latin America. We see it in socialism with Chinese characteristics on the Chinese mainland under the leadership of the Communist Party. We see it in Vietnam with the people-oriented market economy. We see it in the Islamic Republic of Iran. They call it not capitalism, but Islam, the resistance economy. But all over the world, anti-imperialist, centrally planned economies where a revolutionary government controls the means of production and allows growth to continue. That is the way of the future. That economy is marching ahead. Meanwhile, the Western capitalist economy is still dealing with the same problems it always dealt with. The problem of poverty amid plenty, the problem of technology creating economic crisis, and it's crashing and burning, and the West is coming apart, and we are entering not just an economic, but a spiritual crisis. The West no longer believes in anything. There's an identity crisis. Western civilization is in decay, and the East is rising, and the East is rising because the East is red. That's why the East is rising. The East is rising because the East is red, and because they've broken with a system where profits come before people. They've corrected the problems of Cold War socialism. They've got a new hybrid, a new method of building a centrally planned economy and eradicating poverty. They've adjusted for the mistakes of the Cold War, whereas Western capitalism is entering a long-term crisis, and the only solution that the imperialists have to save their system is war. Economic sanctions, threats of war. They are hoping they can save their system with a new world war. But the people of the world want peace. The working people of the Western countries want justice. The middle classes of the Western countries want continued economic growth. It is only the monopolists, the imperialists, the ultra-rich, the oil banking elite. It is only them who want to continue on the road that we're going on. Humanity is lining up against the imperialists, and their days are numbered. Socialism is the inevitable next stage. The working class of the world, the people of the world, will demand an economy that serves them and not the profits of a wealthy few, and we will move toward a more rational society. That's our movement. Writing it down. Very good. That's our movement. That is our movement. And we in the United States, we, the Center for Political Innovation, we, the city building tendency, we are the U.S. incarnation of that movement. We have attended international communist gatherings like the World Festival of Youth and Students. We've just signed on to the World Anti-Imperialist Platform put forward by the United Socialist Party of Venezuela and by the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, and by the People's Democratic Party in South Korea, and that is us. We are the incarnation of this movement, of this global axis of resistance to Western capitalism. That's us. That's our movement. Right? And our movement has gone through many leaps and evolutions, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this stream. I want to talk about that. Right? Probably the biggest expression of our movement in American history was the Communist Party. The Communist Party of the United States of America. Right? In the 1930s, it was a massive, significant organization. And that at that time, it was espousing our politics, the version of our politics that was around. It was condemning Western capitalism for the crisis of overproduction, for the problem of poverty amid plenty, of technology creating poverty. It was explaining that the Great Depression was caused by capitalism in decay and overproduction and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And it was mobilizing and organizing the unemployed. Their slogan was, "Don't starve, fight." And they organized huge rallies and protests of desperately poor, unemployed people to demand an end to the foreclosure of homes, to demand unemployment insurance. They were fighting, against the danger of war. They organized a huge rally called the Bonus Army, where thousands and thousands of unemployed veterans piled into Washington, D.C. to demand the payment of veterans' benefits. The Communist Party that built the industrial unions of this country, the Communist Party of the United States was the biggest expression of this movement that we've seen, in U.S. history, I would argue. The Communist Party in the 1930s, led by William Z. Foster and Gus Hall and others, was the city building tendency. It was aligned with the Soviet Union. It took political leadership from the Soviet Union. And it was a massive organization. And in the early 1930s, it organized unemployment councils, and it published a book called Towards Soviet America, laying out the blueprint of what an America would look like under the rule of the people. Later, in the late 1930s, it launched a popular front, and it joined with Roosevelt to suppress the danger of fascism in the United States. They entered a popular front alliance with the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt supported them in building industrial unions and beating back the danger of fascism and raising up living standards, the sit-down strike wave of 1937. That was our movement, and that was our movement. Now, things got a little complicated after the Second World War. They got a little complicated after the Second World War. After the Second World War, McCarthyism swept the United States. And what McCarthyism was because the communist forces of the world had expanded so rapidly, because communists had been at the center of the fight against fascism in Europe. They had fought in France as La Resistance, the underground resistance. They had fought in Germany. They had been the center of the anti-fascist resistance around the world. After the Second World War, there was a surge in popularity. The French Communist Party grew to millions of members. In West Germany, the Communist Party was illegal, but it had all kinds of influence. In Britain, the Communist Party was big. All over the world, communists were expanding and heavily heavily recruiting after the Second World War. And the U.S. capitalists, they panicked. And so they purged all the people in the Roosevelt administration who'd worked with the communists, and they launched an anti-communist hysteria. Leaders of the Communist Party were thrown in federal prison. People like Alger Hiss, who worked at the United Nations, who wasn't a communist, but had a positive view of the Soviet Union. He was thrown in prison, and all kinds of people had their lives destroyed, and they just did everything they could to stamp out the Communist Party. And McCarthyism in the United States got to be so crazy that the capitalists were accusing each other of being communists. It became kind of a middle-class uprising against big capital, with the Rockefellers being accused of being communists, with members of Congress committing suicide because Joe McCarthy was blackmailing them. And also the civil rights movement got going, because one of the things that the communists had always talked about was racial equality. The communists had built the Civil Rights Congress. Stalin had talked about how the rights of black people and the way they're treated in America proved that the U.S. government were hypocrites when it came to the issue of racism and freedom and democracy, and that communists had always been the champions of the rights of black people. So because of that, the United States government realized that Jim Crow segregation was a ticking time bomb, and that there was a lot of sympathy for the Communist Party among black people, that Malcolm X, who was not a communist but was a black nationalist, was becoming more and more popular among African Americans, and he praised Mao and he praised Stalin, and because of that, you had the U.S. government decide that they wanted to move against Jim Crow segregation. You had the civil rights movement that was emerging. You had McCarthyism kind of being viewed as a threat to the power structure in America because the middle class was using it to go after very powerful people. And so in response to McCarthyism, you had what was called the New Left. And the New Left was an attempt by the wealthiest forces in America to reorient the strategy in the Cold War, to emphasize more covert methods to fight the Soviet Union, and to make the United States look like more of a free and open and tolerant society, to court dissidents and intellectuals in the Soviet Union. You had the rise of the New Left, which was all funded by the CIA and American intelligence, the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, etc. You read about, it was the New Left was completely fake. It was a U.S. government operation. It walked hand in hand with MK Ultra, the project of distributing drugs across the United States. You had the New Left. But there were many young Americans who got involved in the New Left, not because they were, agents of the CIA or whatever, just because they liked the rights of black people. They wanted black people to have civil rights, and they didn't want to go fight in Vietnam. And there were many young Americans who got involved in the New Left, and they got involved in the New Left, and they joined the civil rights marches, and they protested the Vietnam War. And after a while, many of them started to realize that they were, to some degree or other, being used. And you had the rise of what they called the Black Power movement, or the civil rights movement. You had leaders like Stokely Carmichael and others who came along and said, we don't want to be used by the white power structure to simply make American capitalism more equitable and more functional. Instead, we want to fight for black power. And you had the rise of black nationalism. You had the rise of the Black Panthers, which were a communist group of black revolutionary activists in the United States. And their goal was not to make U.S. society more equal and more true to its founding principles, but rather to create a separate black republic and to have a black socialist republic in the Black Belt. Right. And you had a wave of black nationalists who were taking leadership, not from the liberals, but rather from the socialist countries. And Cuba broadcast its revolutionary radio program they did called Radio Free Dixie, and it was urging black people to rise up and fight. China welcomed Robert F. Williams, a black freedom fighter, to China and honored him. And Mao wrote a statement supporting the civil rights movement. And there was an upsurge of black people that felt that the civil rights movement had not gone far enough, that the civil rights movement was a scam. embracing black power. Meanwhile, among the college students who had marched for civil rights and the college students who'd opposed the war in Vietnam, they increasingly started to argue that not only were they pacifists, not only did they think that the war was not necessary, but they started to argue that the Vietnamese were right, the Vietnamese people, and their fight, against U.S. imperialism to break their country free. They were right, and the U.S. imperialists were wrong. And instead of chanting, peace now, and instead of singing give peace a chance, they started chanting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. They would chant, one side's right, one side's wrong, victory to the Viet Cong. And they would urge the soldiers in the military to revolt. They'd say, soldiers, turn your guns around, shoot the generals to the ground. And there started to be a wave of these new left activists and these black revolutionary activists that weren't working for the new left and for the CIA, but were embracing Marxism, Leninism, and communism. And there was a significant layer of these folks that went from being new left liberal activists who were part of the overall pushback against McCarthyism and the fight within the ruling class between the Anglo-American establishment and the military-industrial complex. They broke out of that and they became revolutionaries. And they argued that the country needed a new communist party that was inspired by China, that was revolutionary. And in the 1970s, you had something called the New Communist Movement, a wave of younger folks who'd been involved in the various black civil rights and Vietnam War protest movements that said that's not enough, and we want to go and form a new communist party. And in the 1970s, you had this phenomenon they call the NCM. New Communist Movement. And the New Communist Movement was a variety of different organizations that were formed, and they wanted to get out of the movement and to the masses. They were not interested in being hippies anymore. They cut their hair, they got short hair, they didn't use drugs, and they worked in factories, and they tried to win their co-workers to communism. They tried to win their co-workers to communism, and they built the Communist Labor Party led by Nelson Peary. This is a great book, by the way. It explains the crisis we're in. The future is up to us. They joined the CLP that was started by Nelson Peary. They joined the RCP that was started by Bob Avakian. They joined the October League that was headed by Mike Klonsky, eventually became the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist. They joined the Communist Workers' Party led by Jerry Tung, the CWP. They joined a variety of different communist groups that were formed during this period that understood that the role of revolutionaries is not to kind of try and save Western capitalism and not to extort principles of social justice. The goal is to build a populist working class movement that will rise up and seize control of the means of production and stand in solidarity with global movements of resistance to Western capitalism around the world. That the job of revolutionaries is to become tribunes of the people, to mobilize the masses, to begin fighting against Western capitalism, fight against the big banks and corporations, a fight for a society where the means of production are controlled by the people. And the New Communist Movement was largely not successful. And the reason it wasn't successful was because in the 1970s, the U.S. economy was still very, very strong. It was still very, very strong. And the white middle class of America didn't want to hear it. They were conservative. They didn't like the hippies. They had racist attitudes about the black people. And the industrial middle class of America was not interested. And then in 1978, after these folks had been doing it for a decade, in 1978, there was an economic downturn. And as there was an economic downturn, these folks got desperate. And they said, well, now the economy is crashing. Now these folks are going to listen to us. They did some crazy stuff. The Communist Workers' Party challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a shootout, and 5 of them were murdered. The Greensboro Massacre, 1979. The RCP, they decided that China had sold out the revolution, so they launched a crazy rally at the White House, death to Deng Xiaoping. You had different communist groups doing all kinds of things because they said, now the workers are finally going to listen to us. But it didn't happen. Instead, you had the rise of Reaganism and Ronald Reagan, and you had a wave of right-wing feelings. And at that point, the New Communist Movement basically disbanded. Many of the groups dissolved. Many of the groups retreated. They got jobs as college professors. They got jobs working for the labor union bureaucracy. They got, jobs, or they just began campaigning for the Democrats, for Jesse Jackson, for Harold Washington in Chicago. They just kind of went into the Democratic Party. They did everything else, and they decided you can't do it. Average Americans are too right-wing. They're too racist. There's no way we can build a communist movement in America. We can't win average Americans to communism. That was what they decided. And then the country continued. The 1980s, you had the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, but 2008, the financial crisis came in 2008. And the U.S. economy crashed. And all of a sudden, polls showed that average Americans were very, very interested in hearing about socialism and communism. However, the communist groups were all led by boomers. They were all led by people from the older generation who said, it can't be done. Average Americans are just too racist. Average Americans are just too conservative. We tried this back in 1970. It didn't work. We tried it for a whole decade and it didn't work. It just can't be done. But there were some of us who had the bravery and the foresight and the courage to realize that, yes, it can be done. Bernie Sanders, with his message of opposing the rich and powerful and demanding health care and jobs and education, he got votes all over the red states. All over the red states, workers registered Democrat and voted for Bernie Sanders. And there were many polls that showed that if Bernie Sanders had run against Donald Trump, he would have won. And poll after poll shows that many Americans are interested in socialism and communism and are interested in the struggle of the working class against the capitalists. And furthermore, polls come out continuously that show that Americans don't want a new war. They do not support U.S. intervention in Libya. They do not support U.S. intervention in Syria. They are against all these wars. And so we came together to form the Center for Political Innovation to say that it's time to get out of the movement and get to the masses. It's time to do what the Communist Party did during the 1930s and build a mass movement of the working class. It's time to do what the new communist movement heroically tried to do in the 1970s and was not successful because conditions were not ripe. The conditions are now ripe once again. We have a capitalist crisis that is destroying the Western countries, and we have a rising socialist movement coming from the east of countries that are rising up from poverty with state-run economies and anti-imperialism and revolutionary governments. And the time is right. The time is now to get out of the movement and get to the masses. The time is now to build a community of solidarity, a revolutionary working class movement in the United States of America, where working people who don't want war, working people who don't want to continuously see the country deteriorate, instead can rise up and demand a government of action that fights for working families, a government that will demand that the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power be organized to serve the people. And we put forward a 4-point program. 1, we call for public mass mobilization of the public to rebuild the country, raise people up out of poverty, a new works progress administration, hire all the unemployed, hire the younger folks and put them to work building high-speed railway, put them to work building new highways and bridges, new water treatment facilities, new schools, new universities, new community centers, new power plants. Build the country up again. Have a high-tech makeover for America. Rebuild the heartland of the United States. Build some high-speed railway. Get some great scientists and engineers together to start working on nuclear power. We need a mass mobilization to rebuild America. That would be the first demand. The second demand would be, in order to pay for it, that no more will our natural resources, our oil, our natural gas, our coal, and our timber be privately owned. But natural resources will become public property. The wealth of this country's vast territory, the land, the wealth that's under our feet in the form of oil and gas and coal and timber, that wealth should become public property. It should become the birthright of all Americans. And our natural resources should be operated so that the profits from them go into the public budget to pay for building a new country. The third step would be public control of our banking system. The credit and the lending of money should be done centrally in the interest of the community. No more private bankers, no more Federal Reserve, no more Wall Street ripoffs, Goldman Sachs and Chase and JP Morgan, none of that. Instead, the lending of money should be controlled at a federal, state, and local level. There should be community banks. There should be federal national bank, a great national bank like Alexander Hamilton talked about should be created. And the lending of money should be done in accordance with an overall economic plan. People should be awarded credit if their business or their enterprise fits in with an overall economic plan to raise up the country. Public control of banking, so that the economy is organized and the lending of money is done in the interest of the country. And if we want to have more prosperous neighborhoods, we lend people money to buy homes. We want to have more prosperous businesses, we lend people money to open small businesses. If we want to build infrastructure, we lend money so that infrastructure can be created. No more parasites and bankers, no more usury, but instead a great national bank and national credit system to rebuild the country. And then the final step would be an economic Bill of Rights, ensuring that all Americans, by a guarantee of their birth, got the right to a job, the right to health care, the right to a decent education. And those 4 steps would not in and of themselves create socialism. But the amount of capitalist power that would have to be pushed back in order to create those 4 steps. You'd have to beat back the power of the oil companies. You'd have to beat back the power of the bankers. You'd have to beat back the power of so many rich and powerful folks. In order to enact these 4 economic policies that I just named, you would have to build a mass working class movement, and a working class movement that was capable of defeating the power of big oil, defeating the power of the bankers. And that mass movement would be so powerful that socialism would not be far off. That we seek to build a united front against imperialism, because at this point it is only the ultra rich, only the big oil monopolists, only the Silicon Valley fascists, only the CIA intelligence apparatus and Jeffrey Epstein's crowd. It is only them that benefit from this continued setup. America is getting poorer and poorer and poorer. Working families are struggling to pay their bills. Communities are devastated by foreclosed homes and opioids and rising crime. The population is suffering. And not only is the working class, the bulk of the population, the majority, suffering, but so is the middle class. The doctors and the lawyers are suffering. The small business owners are suffering. They're seeing, that people can't come to their stores when there's not paved roads in their neighborhood. They're seeing that Amazon, with its relationship, its cozy relationship with Washington, D.C., is putting them out of business. So the small business owner has an interest in joining the Revolutionary United Front against imperialism. And furthermore, even some of the richest Americans that aren't part of the club, that aren't in with the elite, right, that got locked out. Some of the richest Americans that their profits come from hotel chains, or their profits come from chains of restaurants. Their profits come from high-tech innovation and startups that's being suppressed by the big monopolies. Even some of the richest Americans would benefit from this. It is only the imperialists, only the imperialist international oligarchy, the ultra-rich, those tied into the global financial system. It is only them that benefit from the way things are, and that a united front against the imperialists could be forged. And that united front would seek to enact those 4 economic policies I just named. And that united front would seek peace with Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran, and would seek to have joint economic ventures, American companies and Chinese companies teaming up to make new breakthroughs in telecommunications and fusion energy. It would seek for American state-run oil companies to team up with Russia and Gazprom and Rosneft and start, making natural gas extraction more efficient than ever. It would seek for there to be joint ventures. It would seek for America and North Korea to have a good economic relationship. It would seek to team up with South and Central America to rebuild that whole region so we didn't have a crisis of people fleeing the drug cartels on our borders. it would change the dynamic. We are up against only the ultra rich and their imperialist monopolies. And we realize that the working class, the class that sells their labor power, is the overwhelming majority of society. And so if there is to be a united front that can defeat the imperialists, the working class will be central in it. It will be central in it because we are the overwhelming majority. And if even these rich capitalists that don't like the way the country is going, their only hope is to enter an alliance with the workers, and that the workers will be at the center of a great united front against the imperialists. If one looks at the Chinese flag, one will see a big yellow star, and then next to it are 4 smaller stars. That big yellow star stands for the Communist Party, with its proletarian ideology and its scientific understanding of the objective laws of history. But those 4 stars next to it represent the block of 4 classes. That the Communist Party, with its proletarian ideology in China, it led the working class, it led the peasant class, it led the middle class, the middle peasantry, and it also led the national bourgeoisie, the national capitalists. And the Communist Party built a block of 4 great classes to defeat the imperialists. And that was what China needed in order to move China on the road to socialism. And ultimately, that is what we need here in the United States of America. We need a block of all great classes, a block of all forces to defeat the imperialists, to have a good relationship with Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and all the anti-imperialist countries, to raise communities out of poverty, to build infrastructure across the country, to fund technological innovation, to defeat the drug cartels, to end the wars around the world, to rebuild communities that have been devastated, to invest in the country. We need a block of 4 classes, a block of all anti-imperialist forces, a united front against the imperialists, and of course, the working class majority, the proletarian class of America, will be at the center of that united front. And it will be those of us who have the proletarian ideology. The scientific understanding of the objective laws of history comes from Marxism, Leninism, and dialectical materialism. We will be at the center of this coalition. We will be that big star at the center of the 4 other stars, right? We will have the understanding that is necessary. Just like the communists in the 1930s, Roosevelt never would have been able to defeat the fascists without the communists. The communists became the key element of the United Front when they built the sit-down strike wave, when they built the CIO and the Congress for Industrial Organizations, and they mobilized people to go to Spain to fight fascism. The communists were essential in the Popular Front against fascism. Likewise, communists and revolutionary anti-imperialists and 21st century socialists will be essential. We will be central in the fight against the big monopolies. And that is where our movement currently stands. However, there is yet another problem we must address, because just as our movement represents the trend of history, the city building tendency, the struggle for historical progress and raising people out of poverty and opposing imperialism and war, just as the imperialists fomented McCarthyism as a way to destroy the Communist Party, just as the imperialists fomented the New Left as a mechanism for correcting the problems of McCarthyism, the imperialists have now fomented another movement that is a threat to America. And that movement is wokism. And they are trying to convince working people that wokism is communism. And that's why it's so hard to talk about Marxism nowadays, because there is a group of people that have been brainwashed by the internet, that have been programmed to have their negative feelings, their destructive impulses unleashed in order to try and bring low-wage degrowthism to America. And this movement, it claims leftist values. It claims to be concerned about social justice, to be concerned about the rights of LGBT people, to be concerned about racism, etc. But it is not. It doesn't want to bring the country together. It wants to tear the country apart. It says that if you wave an American flag, you are the same as a Nazi. It says that if you don't want to go to war with Russia and you don't support sending weapons and bombs and pushing us closer to World War III, that somehow you're the same as a Nazi. This movement advocates violence against people who talk the way we do. This movement advocates the end of free speech in America. It wants to silence and shut down people who talk the way I do. It wants to outlaw anti-war speech. It wants to outlaw criticism of U.S. foreign policy. It wants to outlaw any defense of the existing socialist states. It equates, it declares somehow, even though we are the original anti-fascists, the original anti-racists, it equates us with Nazis, and it calls for the American government to suppress us, and it is anti-human in its essence. Wokism says the problem isn't capitalism. The problem is just that there's too many people in the world, and they want degrowth. They want to drive down the population. They want to reduce consumption. They want to make you poop in your backyard because toilets are the reason that the environment is burning up. You know, they want you to eat bugs because eating good food is not good for Mother Earth. They want you to be more and more impoverished, and it's not about the planet, and it's not about opposing consumerism. It's about saving capitalism. That's what it's really about. It's about saving their system. That's what it's really about. And we must oppose wokeism. Wokeism now is the main danger. However, that could change. It could be that some non-wokist current becomes the main danger. The population is already turning against wokeism. So it could be that they cook up a new thing. Neoconservatism used to be the main method through which the imperialists carried out their goals. It used to be the neocons and the evangelical Christian right. They were the main foot soldiers of the imperialists. But after the Bush years, then they started fomenting wokeism. And now we're seeing how dangerous wokeism is. And it may be that wokeism gets all played out. The population gets so weary, they invent a new kind of movement that is just as dangerous in order to carry out their will. And we would oppose that movement as well. There is no tactical orientation that is permanent. If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. But right now, the ultra-rich are looking to create a low-wage police state, and they are using wokeism as the main group of foot soldiers to enforce it. They are using Antifa. They are using the Silicon Valley censorship gang. They are using cancel culture. They are using the mainstream media. They are using accusations of being a fascist or spreading Russian disinformation as their main way to create a low-wage police state, to go after Julian Assange, to promote torture, to silence dissent. That is the main method they are using. And likewise, we therefore oppose it, right? We would oppose this movement. We would oppose it. But that could change. And if some new movement emerged, we would reorient our tactics, because there is no permanent tactical situation. There is no permanent tactical orientation. If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. Right now, that's the situation we're in. And so the Center for Political Innovation seeks to build a movement among the American people that strives for a government of action that fights for working families, that opposes the low-wage police state, that opposes the danger of a new world war, that says Russia is not our enemy, China is not our enemy, Cuba and Venezuela and Iran are not our enemy. Our enemy is on Wall Street. Our enemy is in the Pentagon. Our enemy is in Washington, D.C. And we need to stand arm in arm with the people of the world and demand a government that works for peace and that is a government of action to fight for working families. This is what our movement espouses. And that was just a quick rundown of where we're at. And that is our movement. And right now, I have two tasks that I am working with the Center for Political Innovation to carry out in the new year. The first task that I seek to carry out in the new year is that we are going to be organizing a very big anti-imperialist rally somewhere in America on March 25th. Location is not yet announced. Details are to come. We are trying to figure out logistics and how we will do it. Hopefully in early January, those details will emerge. But on March 25th, somewhere in this country, on the East Coast, there will be an anti-imperialist gathering, an anti-imperialist rally in which the Center for Political Innovation will rally the people. We will have different speakers. We will have different musicians. We will have an anti-imperialist extravaganza somewhere on the East Coast on March 25th. So mark your calendar and pay attention for the announcement that's coming. We may need volunteers to help us out. Details are forthcoming. But March 25th will be a day that the city building tendency has a public gathering to put forward our message of solidarity, anti-imperialism, and demanding justice for working people. March 25th, that is the day. And that is my current focus, is organizing and getting the details together about March 25th and how we're going to put it together and who the speakers will be and what the venue will be and how we will video record the event and who will be there and how we'll have security for the event and who will be the musicians. And that's what I'm focused on figuring out. And I've got, I'm juggling a lot of different things, but that is my first task. My second task of 2023, as the year speeds ahead, is the Korean Peninsula. Because Donald Trump did a great thing when he went to North Korea. He was the first American president ever to set foot in North Korea. He went to North Korea. He shook hands with Kim Jong-un. And for whatever reason, there is a faction in the American ruling class, Mike Pompeo, Tulsi Gabbard, and others, Donald Trump, that want to continue the peace process. They want North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, and they want to lift the sanctions on North Korea. And because the Korean people have been through hell and starvation and death and suffering, and because war on the Korean Peninsula is so profitable for military corporations, and because North Korea is an anti-imperialist state, and because North Korea really wants foreign investment, and because it would be good for America as well, think of all the jobs that Americans could get if North Korea opened up, how good it would be for the American economy. I feel that it is our duty, because there's one faction of the ruling class, for whatever reason. Mike Pompeo is not a good dude. He's not a good guy. We know that. He's a war hawk. He's anti-China, whatever. Mike Pompeo, for whatever reason, he wants to get along with North Korea, right? Donald Trump, not a good guy, murdered Qasem Soleimani, etc. But for whatever reason, he wants peace with North Korea. Tulsi Gabbard, much better. I like a lot of her things, not perfect on everything. She wants peace with North Korea. And so that is an opening for us as anti-imperialists, as people who are sympathetic for the goals and the ideals of the Korean Revolution and the Juche ideology. It is our duty to utilize this division within the ruling class and say, we are willing to work to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. And, if Mike Pompeo and Tulsi Gabbard and others, they want to restart those talks, we should be rallying to start those talks. And my vision is that when Donald Trump starts having his rallies, people will walk out of those rallies. And at those rallies, they will walk out of the rallies when it's over to see a big banner with a picture of Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands. And it'll say, finish what Trump started, peace on the Korean Peninsula. And they will see volunteers from the Center for Political Innovation and other organizations giving them fact sheets about peace on the Korean Peninsula. And my vision is that there could be some kind of mass rally in Madison Square Garden or in a big football stadium somewhere. And it would be a rally for peace on the Korean Peninsula. And we would hear from Dennis Rodman, and we would hear from Tulsi Gabbard, and we would hear from other forces that wanted peace on the Korean Peninsula, churches of Korean Americans, Korean American churches and organizations, and peace activists and others would rally for peace on the Korean Peninsula, and there would be a push that what Trump started must not end, and that there should be peace on the Korean Peninsula. That would be the push, and that entering a strategic alliance with a faction in the ruling class that might want that for their own reasons is something that we could do. Something that we could do because it needs to be done and because the Koreans need it, and they are ready to get some of that foreign investment. So that is my second project for 2023. Those are the two things I am working on now. The March 25th conference, details forthcoming, in which we will put forward our program and rally our people. And I mean, our rallies, if you've ever been to one, They are amazing. We did one last year in Chicago. We did another one in Austin, Texas. They are amazing. The chanting and the speeches and the music, they are awesome. Our rallies are really, really something special. And we're getting better at doing them, right? We just had a great meeting. I sat down with different people and we talked about how we're going to stage this one differently. And we talked about the lighting and we talked about the music and we talked about the seating. And it's going to be great. This rally on March 25th, details forthcoming, is going to be awesome. It's going to be awesome. And I'm really excited. I'm really excited for it. We need anti-imperialism now more than ever. So mark your calendars for March 25th. And this effort to build peace on the Korean Peninsula, this effort to make peace on the Korean Peninsula, that is ongoing. And I'm talking to different forces, different Korean Americans, different organizations, the Korean Friendship Association, different organizations about this idea for a mobilization for peace on the Korean Peninsula. And this would not be a small endeavor. This would be a well-funded operation to give support to that section of the ruling class, and that wants to negotiate with North Korea, right? It is our responsibility. It is our responsibility that the North Koreans have the right to sign a peace treaty with the United States and to have American companies do business there. And it would be good for America too, right? North Korea is full of minerals. That's the mountainous part of the Korean Peninsula. And there's a lot of minerals in those mountains. Did you know that? There's a lot of minerals in those mountains. And, North Korea could really build up their economy, teaming up with American and Chinese and Russian telecommunications companies, extracting those minerals and getting wealthier. Most North Koreans can speak more than one language. I dream of the day that President Tulsi Gabbard flies to North Korea for a historic visit, signing diplomatic relations between the United States and People's Korea. And she brings with her on the airplane a delegation from the Center for Political Innovation. And we, members of the Center for Political Innovation, we tour North Korea, going to their universities, teaching about the story of John Brown and the story of Malcolm X and the story of William Z. Foster, while Kim Jong-un comes to America. And he does a tour of America, and he brings with him members of the Kim Il-sung Youth and the Korean Workers' Party, and they tour America teaching Juche ideology, and at universities in Texas and universities in Portland, Oregon, and universities in Minnesota. We have lectures by English-speaking young Koreans explaining the Juche ideology, explaining Marxism, Leninism, and the teachings of Kim Il-sung at American universities. And that's what I dream of. That's what I dream of, the day that North Korea and the United States become friends. And that will happen because there's a mass movement in the United States that wants to do what North Korea has done and break free from the power of the bankers and the big monopolies. That's what I want to see happen. That is what I want to see happen. And I believe that we can play a role in making all of this happen. We can play a role in pushing for peace on the Korean Peninsula. We can play a role in rallying the American people to understand that Russia and China are not our enemy, and that our enemy is the big bankers and the ruling class that is driving this country and grinding it into poverty. We have an important role to play as anti-imperialists and revolutionaries in the center of the empire. And we can show people that you don't have to be a woke. You don't have to be a woke. You don't have to believe in this destructive, synthetic left toxic ideology, but you don't have to believe in capitalism either. You don't have to be a defender of the free market and radical individualism, that there is a way out. And while we do everything, one thing that we are always doing is building a community of solidarity. Because at the end of the day, this ain't social media entertainment. We are never going to be able to out-whiz-bang the ruling class. They're always going to have sexier videos than we have. They are always going to have, bigger production values, bigger TV networks, etc. What we are going to offer people is a real-life community, a group of people that they can rely on, a group of people that they can depend on. That's what we're going to be building. We're going to be building a community. And as the crisis in the United States intensifies, rather than simply looking for internet entertainment, and rather than simply looking for a way to express their pessimism, there's going to be a desperate need for something like what the Communist Party built in the 30s, unemployment councils, associations of the public. There's going to be a desperate need for in real life communities of solidarity as the crisis intensifies, as the economy gets worse. And that's where we will step up. And that's the only way that we will be able to succeed as an organization. We will never be able to, win the battle for the control of communications. I'm really glad to be on here spreading this message. But really, folks, I want you to read the last speech of Enver Hoxha. And I was talking about this. It was actually talking with Tyler. I went on my friend Tyler McConnell's YouTube channel last night. I went on his YouTube channel. It was awesome, really good stuff. But it got me thinking. So I want people to read this, right? I want people to read this, right? Hold on, right? This speech I'm about to drop in here, right? This is really important. This is really important stuff. Really important stuff. So hold on. This is 1979. Enver Hoxha, the leader of socialist Albania, who was, wasn't perfect, obviously, but he was a master tactician. And he wrote this speech, 1979, The Marxist-Leninist Movement and the World Crisis of Capitalism. And if you read this speech that he gave, it was a lecture he gave to all the communists in the world who had, taken leadership from Albania. And he gives them an orientation because of the economic downturn and the capitalist crisis. He says, now is your chance. Now is your chance. And he gives them an orientation. And Enver Hoxha, despite, some of his weird views on a lot of things, Enver Hoxha knew what he was talking about. And the reason that he knew what he was talking about was because he actually made a revolution. Enver Hoxha didn't just talk about revolution. He actually made one. And in fact, this is a great book that I read a long time ago. It was called The History of the Party of Labor of Albania. And this is the official textbook history of the Communist Party or the Labor Party of Albania. And do you know how many people the Communist Party of Albania had just 4 or 5 years before they took power? Do you know how many members they had? They had 12 members. And a lot of them weren't even in Albania. Enver Hoxha ran a tobacco shop in Paris. He was an Albanian guy who ran a little tiny tobacco shop in Paris. No one had any idea. And they were a tiny group in a tiny country, tiny group of people in Albania that liked the Soviet Union. But then when the Nazis invaded, they said, this is our chance. This is our chance. We can build the anti-Nazi resistance. And if you read this book, you will learn that Enver Hoxha, the leader of socialist Albania, was a brilliant tactician. He understood how to take up history's challenge. And when the Nazis invaded Albania, he turned the Nazi invasion into a moment where the communists started leading the mass struggle. And by the time World War II came to its end, they were the ruling party of Albania. Soviet troops did not liberate Albania. Albania was liberated by a revolutionary movement formed and led by communists. And they polarized the country. Are you with the Nazi invaders or are you with the anti-Nazi forces? Because if you were with the anti-Nazi forces, everybody knew that the communists, they were the central anti-Nazi fighters. History of the Party of Labor of Albania. So Enver Hoxha knew how to organize people. For all his flaws, he was a weird leader. His policies in the 1980s, he cut off the Soviet Union. He cut off China. It was a pretty strange, his leadership of Albania we can ask questions about. But if there's anybody who knew how to organize, it was Enver Hoxha. And Enver Hoxha, in 1979, he gave a speech to his followers. He had a group of communists around the world that took leadership from Albania, and he told them what I just told all of you, which is we will never be able to out-propagandize the ruling class. We will never be able to do that. However, in an economic crisis, we have the ability to build the movements of the people. People will need community. They will need a space for resisting the economic crisis, and that's our opening. That is our opening. But Enver Hoxha isn't the only one who said it. Stalin said it in the 1930s. It was said by other people, right? It was said by many other people. But this is just one example of a communist leader giving his followers orientation and telling them correctly that when there's an economic crisis, this is an opportunity, right? He said, our people have a wise saying, poverty breeds discord, and this poverty is an outcome of capitalist regimes. The people in those countries are impoverished. Therefore, in order to escape poverty, the wretched absolutely must be made conscious and understand the situations, must organize themselves and strive to organize the resistance against oppression, to organize the popular striking force, which gradually becomes a terrible force against the rotten capitalist regime, where the situation is ripe for revolutionary activity. Our Marxist-Leninist theory teaches us every revolutionary activity must be guided by revolutionary Marxist-Leninist theory. The objective of every genuine revolutionary movement is to establish the hegemony of the working class. In the ranks of the unemployed in the capitalist revisionist countries, there is a great spiritual force of people revolted because they are short of food. In those countries, there is a great force of people revolted because the prospects of a decent life have been closed to them. They cannot find jobs, and they have made desperate by this situation. They are easily corrupted and misled by special intensive preparation of the regime to involve them in acts of terrorism. This is the source of participation of young people in terrorist red brigades. Many of these young people do not see any way out other than terrorist acts. But we Marxist-Leninists must show them that isolated terrorist acts and gangsterism, in which the capitalist regime has involved them, is trying to involve them more deeply and not to bring improvement to the situation, the youth or the unemployed, but on the contrary, to bring about a fascist coup by the bourgeoisie. These groups are nothing but the vanguard detachments of fascism. In the face of these capitalist phenomena, we Marxist-Leninists must not sit idle. We must not permit the masses of people to be intimidated by the acts of terrorists, anarchists, but rather, on the contrary, we should work so that the people of this country or of that capitalist country are not afraid of them. When the Marxists act against terrorism, it is likely that the class enemies will tax them with taking part in the activities of the capitalist regime. But the slanders of the enemies must not inhibit the revolutionary activity. The Marxist-Leninists act in two parallel directions, both against the regime in power, against the bourgeois parties, whether social democratic, socialist, or revisionist, but at the same time against terrorism. Revolutionaries cannot wage this struggle simply by issuing a newspaper, by carrying out extensive political ideological propaganda, or by acting together with the masses in order to make the truth clear to them and convince them the concrete actions against the evils of old society. The enemies must be attacked on all fronts in unity with the masses. Otherwise, success cannot be achieved. To do this requires strong organization, courage, and many great sacrifices. At these difficult moments, when capitalism is in crisis and is seeking to establish its savage dictatorship, sacrifices on the part of Marxist-Leninists, the working class, and progressive elements are indispensable. But every revolutionary action requires courage, intelligence, and vigorous actions. There is to be no retreat in the face of this situation. And the just and heroic struggle of the Palestinian people for their liberation of territories seized and occupied by Israel is a fine example. Despite the fact that it is not led by Marxist-Leninists, we still support it. We support it as it is the national liberation, anti-imperialist struggle of the Palestinian people. This is a great speech by Enver Hoxha. Go and read it for yourself. This guy is a guy who understood what you're supposed to do in times of a capitalist crisis. And he had a mass movement of people around the world, a lot of whom were whack jobs, or whack jobs. They couldn't fit in with the regular Communist Party. They couldn't fit in with the China-aligned Communist Party, so they aligned with the Albania-aligned Communist Party. A lot of them were whack jobs. But this was a guy who had actually made a revolution, had actually fought the Nazis and built a socialist country in Albania. And so he sat down with a lot of these people that were cranks and whack jobs who aligned with him, and he gave them a big, stern speech about how we can actually organize and build a movement amid a capitalist crisis. So I encourage you to go and read it. Go and read the Marxist-Leninist movement and the world crisis. What's it called? The Marxist-Leninist movement and the world crisis of capitalism. Go and read Enver Hoxha's speech, because this speech gives in pretty basic language, explains what it is we're supposed to do, what it is that we are supposed to do, and rejecting left adventurism and terrorism, etc. So that I wanted to encourage you all, and thank you, Tyler, for making me think about that last night. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. It is always appreciated. And now we'll start doing the roll call. Names and locations, names and locations. I will call you out as I see you, names and locations. Keep in mind, though, I only have 2 super chat questions so far. So if there's something you want me to talk about, by all means, shoot me a super chat. It's going to be a pretty short question and answer period tonight, unless I get some more super chats, because I've only got 2 of them so far. But there you go. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Who's with us? Names and locations, names and locations. St. David in Bermuda, Cumming, Georgia, Ryan in Kansas City, The Lou, Kieran in San Diego, John Whitty in Houston, Meredith and Quinn Anderson. Happy birthday from Joshua Tree. Well, thank you, Kinky. I've still got another 45 minutes before my birthday. Back from Bendigo, David Fox, Michael in Houston, JT24 in Mississippi, Yulia Kambate in Boston, Alex from Brazil, Heidi from Edinburgh, Jack from New Jersey, Tristan in Maryland, Carl in Washington, Ohio, Jack in New Jersey, Andy Tate from Romanian prison, Germany, Carl in Washington, Elizabeth Y in Portland, Upper Pennsylvania, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, Abel Malcolm in Wisconsin, Auckland, New Zealand, Bob Troy in New York, Detroit, Michigan, Anthony, Saviero, Mexico, Carolyn and Dario from Brooklyn, great folks, Bob Troy in New York, China, very, very good, very, very good, right? New Yorkers, we're supposed to say China, Micah in Las Vegas, Yonatan Mahari in London, the United Kingdom. AMLO in Phoenix, Arizona. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Micah from Las Vegas. Good stuff, folks. Good stuff. Good stuff. We got Neil Fraser in Hong Kong. VPN from Russia. We got Jacob out of Louisiana. RC in Concepcion. Someone's wishing me a happy birthday on Facebook. Thank you very much, John. Jamie in St. Paul. Very, very good. Very, 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 very good. So glad to have you all here tonight. I guess I'll do a couple business announcements. In case any of you missed it, I was announcing that the first patrons-only stream of the new year will be on January 2nd, which is a Monday. So if you want to be part of it, sign up. You can sign up on the Patreon. That's one way to be part of it. And the Center for Political Innovation, as I mentioned, is having some exciting activities coming up on the East Coast in March 25th. So if you want to be part of our operations, you want to join the city building tendency, by all means, join the Center for Political Innovation. You can sign up there. So far, I have 2 super chat questions. So I will proceed to answer them. And if people have more super chat questions, by all means, shoot them my way, because that's what the second half of the show is. I just spoke for an hour and 15 minutes, and now I'm going to start answering people's questions. So if there's more things you want me to talk about, by all means, shoot me a super chat. The first super chat question I received is: socialism in Korea has successfully fought a war for decades against U.S. imperialism. Yes. Technically, the United States and North Korea are still at war. There's never been a peace treaty signed. There was a, what do they call it? It's not a peace treaty. It's a, what do they call that? The end of the Korean War. What do they call it? I forget what they called it. It was like it wasn't a ceasefire. It was, it started with an A. I can't remember what it is, but the end of the Korean War, there was never a peace treaty. They never signed a peace treaty. So technically, the United States is still at war with North Korea. Armistice, that's what it was. There was an armistice, but there was never a peace treaty signed. So the USA is still technically at war with North Korea. That's why there's no diplomatic relations with North Korea. There's no North Korean embassy in the United States. There's no North Korean consulates. There is no relationship between the U.S. government and North Korea. And that is a shame. That is a shame. But the Korean people, they delivered what was considered to be the first huge epic defeat to the United States. The United States rolled into the Korean Peninsula and was ready to crush the DPRK. And they went in there and they bombed every building above 1 story tall. Every single one. above 1 story tall. They killed about 4 million people in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. And then China realized this was a threat to them. So China came to the aid of the Korean people. And the Korean War, China got involved, and China beat back and forced the United States back to the 38th parallel. That was big. And what's also particularly crazy is that Mao Zedong, his own son, died in the Korean War. Can you believe that? The son of Mao, Mao's own flesh and blood, died protecting the Korean people from U.S. imperialism. But it gets even crazier. The Korean War was a wild moment. It was a wild moment. Why don't we just talk about that, right? Since if there's anything else people want me to talk about, super chats are always appreciated. But since we only got 2 super chats, we can reflect for a moment about the Korean War, because the Korean War is a war that nobody knows anything about. No one knows anything about it, right? Technically, it wasn't a war. It was like, first of all, this was the first war the USA never declared. World War II, they declared war. World War I, they declared war. But this was an undeclared war. It was a police action. It was a police action, they called it, right? They never declared war. It was the Korean War was a police action. And what happened was it was a police action by the United States, they under the guise of the UN. And as the United States rolled into the Korean Peninsula, the USA was defending the dictator, Syngman Rhee, right? They weren't defending democracy. Syngman Rhee was a dictator. And the government in South Korea was not democratic. And in fact, in South Korea, the people had wanted to have a referendum. They'd wanted to have a constitutional referendum, in which the people in the North got to vote, and they wouldn't allow it. And then the people of Jeju Island revolted, and they protested, demanding the right to have free elections and to have the Communist Party be included in the elections. And there was the brutal massacre at Jeju Island. And it was in response to that North Korea ultimately moved ahead and tried to, reunify their country and free their comrades. They always tell you the way it's taught in the United States is they say the Korean War was the North invaded the South. You do realize that these were all one people, right? I mean, there was not 2 separate countries, North and South Korea at that time. There was one Korea. Japan had been occupying and oppressing them. Japan got defeated. And then there was going to be one government for the peninsula. And then in the South, there was a military coup, and a military dictator declared power, backed by the United States. And he said, no, we're not going to start unifying. We're not going to have talks unifying with the South. And then the people in the South started protesting and saying, we want to have free and fair elections. We want to be the same country as our northern country folk. And then with the backing and support of the United States, they killed them all. And at Jeju Island, there was a brutal massacre at Jeju Island, thousands of people slaughtered. And at that point, the North said, okay, we have a responsibility to our country folk. We're gonna go drive the Americans out of the Korean Peninsula and bring the country back together. And they portray this as aggression. How is it aggression, right? It's like there's one Korea, and they see their own people being killed, and so they move in to protect them, and they're being killed by a power backed up by the United States. This is not aggression, right? 1929 and 2008, how did trade unions hold up in your opinion? Okay. 1929 and 2008, how did trade unions hold up in your opinion? A good question. I wrote it down. And the Korean War was pretty wild. One thing that happened during the Korean War that I've read a lot about it because it's fascinating. This is a book about what happened during the Korean War. This is called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. And it's about how during the Korean War, there were all these American soldiers, American GIs, who got taken prisoner. They got taken as prisoners of war. And in China, they confessed to committing war crimes against the Korean people. And they confessed to war crimes, and a lot of them became communists in China. And the U.S. government, it drove them crazy. That's where the term brainwashing comes from. They said, how could these Americans be confessing to war crimes? How could they be believing in communism? This must never have happened. Right? And that's this whole thing about brainwashing and all that comes out of there. And the CIA started doing all kinds of crazy research to try and figure out how it was how it was that these good, wholesome American boys could convert to communism. Because it just seemed like so, so shocking. How could this happen? Well, it was that a lot of them had done awful things, and a lot of them, they were convinced by what the communists had to say. That happened during the Korean War. Another story I heard, in William Z. Foster's History of the Communist Party of the United States, he mentions that there was only one protest against the Korean War. That's true, right? The Vietnam War, there was a lot of protests against it, but there was only one protest against the Korean War. And I know somebody who participated in it, or I knew her. She died, right? Frances Dostal, founding member of the Workers' World Party, she went to the only protest against the Korean War because that was the height of McCarthyism. The Communist Party was illegal. And in the United States, the Communist Party was completely illegal, the period of the witch hunts. But in New York City, they had a rally against the Korean War. And the way they did it is they all dressed up in suits and ties, and that she was a nurse. She tells the story that she was at work one day and someone took her aside and said to her, you really ought to be at, and like whispered to her, be in Times Square at like 2:00 on Saturday. Something's going to go down, comrade. You didn't hear it from me. It was like that level of organized. It was like underground resistance practically. And that person that she talked to was someone who was in the Communist Party USA that she knew about. And they whispered to her, be in Times Square at a certain time. And she went to Times Square, and there were a bunch of guys in suits just kind of standing around, a lot of women in long dresses. No one was doing anything. And then somebody shouted very loudly a code word. And they shouted a code word. And then all of a sudden they unfurled a very big banner that said, U.S. off the Korean Peninsula, Young Communist League. And it was the Young Communist League had this big banner, U.S. off the Korean Peninsula. And almost immediately after they unfurled this banner, the police showed up with clubs and just started beating them and clubbing them, and all of that. And so then they shouted a code word again, and they rolled up the banner, and they retreated. And they retreated, and they went down to 34th Street. Right, 42nd Street's Times Square. They went down to 34th Street, Madison Square. And again, they just stood there. They waited until there was enough people there. And someone shouted the code word, and then they unfurled that big banner. And then the police came down on them and clubbed them and arrested a few more of them. And they rolled up the banner and they ran. And they did this all the way through Manhattan. And by the time they were done, almost all of them had been arrested. But thousands of people in New York City saw this big banner, Peace on the Korean Peninsula, Young Communist League. And at the height of McCarthyism, using underground revolutionary tactics, they organized that. Another story is there's a writer named Howard Fast, who was a member of the Communist Party. He rented a hotel room in Times Square. And in the hotel room, he got big speakers. And he wired up big speakers, right? Which back then, technology was nowhere near. He wired up these huge speakers. And at midnight, when it's very quiet, it was very quiet, he wired up these huge speakers and started blasting anti-war speeches from the Communist Party across Times Square. And the police didn't know where it was coming from. And across Times Square in New York City, blasting from these huge speakers in a hotel room. You had someone reading off about, the war crimes that were being committed, the Korean people and their struggle for peace. And the police were running up and down the square and trying to figure out where the noise was coming from and trying to figure out what hotel room it was in. And it's a wild story, right? And this is how the communists had to organize back during McCarthyism. But you imagine that, just a normal night, Times Square. Back then, things were a lot quieter. Rock and roll music hadn't gotten started, and, technology wasn't where it's at. All quiet. And then all of a sudden, from some hotel room, they have these big, huge wired speakers. U.S. imperialism is slaughtering the Korean people. The Korean people want peaceful reunification and democracy. Blasting, right? That was what the Communist Party did. So even during McCarthyism, they did amazing, heroic revolutionary things. And the Korean, they protested and organized against the Korean War at a time that they were completely suppressed and illegal. So that's those stories, to hear communists who were there, during those times. I mean, that is invaluable. It's really invaluable, because those were bad years. Those were bad years for the global communist movement, but yet they still managed to have solidarity. They still managed to have solidarity with the Korean people amid that heavy repression, when half the Communist Party was in jail, et cetera. So, we're very proud that that's our heritage. And we're not going to let the synthetic left, try to claim that heritage, because Vosh would have murdered these people, right? They liked Stalin. They liked Mao. They didn't talk about trans issues. Vosh would have killed these people. He would have punched Nelson Mandela in the face. He would have shot the organizers of the civil rights movement, because they were like me. They were tankies. They were hardliners. They were anti-imperialists. The wokes have absolutely no right to claim the legacy of the Black Panthers, to claim the legacy of the Communist Party and the labor movement, because they were nothing like them. They were nothing like them. And we need to not let them claim that heritage. And we need to insist that, no, this is the history of the city building tendency. Those folks were patriotic, etc. Any other stories of old timers during McCarthyism? I'll write that down. That's a good one. All right. Next super chat question I've got. Explain how Yeltsin succeeded in 1991. Well, Boris Yeltsin was able to succeed because there was a big chunk of the Soviet Communist Party that did not believe in communism, right? That during the late years of Brezhnev, the last years of Brezhnev's leadership in the Soviet Union in the early 80s, became very clear that the bulk of the Soviet Communist Party did not believe in communism. There was a divide. Beneath this, officially, everyone said they believed in Marxism, Leninism, and they talked about it in a very simple, watered-down way. The state ideology was put out in a very simplistic way. And there was this feeling among the population that it was best to stay out of politics, because look what happened during the Stalin years. People got arrested and stuff like that. And so everyone just kind of mouthed, yes, socialism, dictatorship of the proletariat, but they just mouthed it in a very mild way. But beneath the surface, within the Soviet Communist Party's leadership, there were two factions. The first faction, okay. First faction was the synthetic left faction, right? And that was, Gorbachev's faction, and they believed that the West wasn't so bad. They believed in democracy and human rights, and they wanted to transition the Soviet Union to be a social democracy. They were convinced that the Soviet Union, if they dissolved the Soviet Union, if they gave up the monopoly on power for the Communist Party, that they would allow Russia to become like Norway or Sweden, to be a welfare state. And they believed that Marxism, Leninism was a totalitarian ideology. They believed in freedom of thought. They believed in Western ideas that were mixed in with counterculture and synthetic leftism. And they liked Beatles music, and they liked MTV and rock and roll, and they were convinced that, they were against American capitalism, which was greedy, etc. But at the same time, they were also against hardline communism, which was authoritarian, etc. And they had bought in, and they referred to them in the Soviet government. They referred to them as the reformists. They were the reformists. They were and the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968 had been kind of a brief moment for these folks. But really, in the 80s, these folks really there were a lot of people in the Soviet Communist Party that were convinced that, yeah, Reagan was bad. Yeah, the Republicans were bad, but Walter Mondale was okay. And look, there's Bernie Sanders, the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and and Angela Davis. She's an American, and they let her speak on TV. And that there's all these black people in America who they don't hate communism. And there was this wing of the Soviet Communist Party that was suckered into believing that that communism was really part of this global consciousness awakening. Right? That was neither pro-communist or anti-communist. It just believed in freedom and was against authoritarianism and wanted just, peace and love, man. And, there was this huge effort to convince the leaders of the Soviet Communist Party that basically they would be able to join the synthetic left. Basically, that the synthetic left was this global movement that didn't want to destroy the Soviet Union, wasn't pro-communist, but it wasn't anti-communist either, etc. That was one wing. That was the westernized wing of the Soviet Communist Party. Gorbachev was part of that. And Gorbachev ultimately rejected the dictatorship of the proletariat. He said they needed to instead embrace universal human values. He wanted to set up a welfare state in the Soviet Union. He actually used that term. He said the welfare state is the correct model. You can't have a centrally planned economy anymore, etc. But in addition in addition to Gorbachev, there was another wing that they were calling the National Bolsheviks, right? And that's what they were calling them. And they were people within the KGB. The KGB was a stronghold of these kind of folks. And they were questioning the official state ideology of the Soviet Union as well. They were not believing in Marxism, Leninism, and they were converting to Orthodox Christianity, right? The Russian Orthodox Church was now legal, and the Russian Orthodox Church is very conservative. And there is a lot of like Russian nationalism mixed in with Christianity in some wings of the Russian Orthodox Church. They believe that Russia has a special role in the world. And so among the more conservative elements in the party, a lot of the folks that were in the security services and stuff, they liked Stalin, but they didn't like him because he was a communist. They thought Stalin was like a great czar. And they thought about, Ivan the Terrible had unified all the peoples of the Russian Empire. And they felt like, the Russian people have a duty. Like actually, the Soviet national anthem, right? The words, right? The words translate to unbreakable union of freeborn republics. Great Russia unites us now all into one. And there was a belief that Russia, right? And this is a long-standing belief that Russia, because it's the big country, right? It has a responsibility to unify all the countries of that region. And it's like the spiritual duty that Russia has been ordained by God to bring the peoples of that part of the world together so that they can have a higher living standard, right? That it's just like how they believe, I think in China, they talk about the mandate of heaven, right? It's a similar belief, right? That Russia, the country of Russia, has the responsibility, I believe the Orthodox folks believe it comes from God, has the responsibility to bring the peoples of Ukraine and Moldova and Lithuania and all of them together so that they can all have a better life and live in peace, right? And that Ivan the Terrible, if you watch the movie Ivan the Terrible, he believed that, right? That was his belief, right? And that he's a great hero in Russian history because he brought the people together, right? And there was a feeling that Russia has a like God-given duty to unify the peoples of that region. And that Stalin was great because he did that, and that the Soviet Union, its achievements, defeating the Nazi invaders, raising people up out of poverty, this isn't so much about communism as this is instead about the spiritual duty of Russia, right? This is about the spiritual legacy and history of Russia. Russians are not like the West. They have their own history and traditions, and the West is decadent, and they have homosexuality, and they use drugs, and the women are not good housewives or whatever. And that Russia has this deep traditional spiritual value, and the czars, and that there's I don't know what you want to call it, Orthodox nationalism. People call it national Bolshevism or whatever. There was that also, right? And that was rising as well. And there were a lot of KGB officers and a lot of like people in the Communist Party they called the hardliners because they would take more anti-American positions. But and again, they all mouthed Marxism, Leninism publicly, but beneath the surface, they believed in Orthodox nationalism. And that's what was going on there. So Marxism, Leninism was not the official ideology. You had some who believed in the Orthodox nationalism, and you had some who believed in synthetic leftism. And that was a failure of the Communist Party. The Communist Party, they had to unify the country. That had to have ironclad discipline. And in the face of that, they didn't have a society where you had open debate. And that was a problem, right? The Soviet Union didn't have open debate and discussion because they couldn't, right? When they were during World War II, you think everyone could just say what's on their mind? Of course not. Right. And that they tried. They had multiple parties in the first few years. They had the Russian Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, and then they had the left Menshevik Party. Then they had the left Social Democratic Party. But then, Lenin got, shot by somebody who was part of one of those parties. And then, pretty soon they had only one party. And then Lenin eventually outlawed factions within the Bolshevik Party. He said, no more factions. We all have the same line within the Bolshevik Party. And that in order to keep the Soviet Union together, they had to have ironclad discipline. And because of that, they didn't have public debate, right? In the Soviet Union, you didn't know, right? That they would, the government, when they passed a law, it would be unanimous. The whole parliament would vote in favor of it. Now, obviously, everyone didn't agree with that law. And behind the scenes, there was debate about it. But publicly, there was a feeling that for the good of the nation, for the good of the country, we all have to vote the same and show that we're all on the same page. And in a way, that was a strength of the Soviet Union, And it got them through World War II, and it got them through the hard years, and it got them to raise up the country. However, the U.S. imperialists turned a strength, their ability to be all together and all for one, they turned it into a weakness, because when there's no public debate, nobody knows where people stand. No one has any idea where people stand. And so then people start developing their own ideas in secret. And those ideas people develop in secret never get refuted. Right. And that was the problem. And that Western propaganda, the radio, Voice of America and Western music and all that started to have a big influence. And the Soviet government never argued against or refuted this stuff because no one acknowledged publicly that they believed this stuff. So Western ideas were seeping into the Soviet Union. People were learning to think like Western liberals, and they were developing synthetic left and pro-imperialist and non-Marxist ideas. And the Soviet government was never giving an answer to it because these people would never say it publicly, right? And that when you don't have public debate, it leads to a situation where you don't know where everyone stands and you do a lot of guessing. And the newspapers in the United States were always guessing about what people in the Soviet Communist Party thought. Nobody really knew. Right. And that a lot of the way, like George Soros would set up these art galleries and such in the Soviet Union, where young people that wanted to be artists would like get some grant money to like paint paintings and stuff. And that the USA was covertly pushing these, counter-revolutionary ideas. And the Soviet government was not doing a good way. It was not very good at refuting them because there was no like debate. Right. And they talk about this. And in a way, like in the Soviet Union, generally, if people were saying anti-communist things, for a while, they might ignore them. And then if they continued to do it, they disappeared in the middle of the night and no one ever heard from them again. And the secret police would remove them. Well, the problem with that is their ideas never get refuted, right? And that it creates an atmosphere where people actually think, wow, that guy must have said something, right? Because, the government had to take him away in the middle of the night and people get more interested in what they have to say. And it backfired, right? And that ultimately, if you look at Cuba, if you look at China, if you look at socialist countries, they do the opposite now. They encourage public debate and discourse. They encourage public debate, and that there are big debates in Cuba about how the government should move forward. And there are big debates in China, right? And that people do publicly argue about these issues. There is an atmosphere where there's debate, number one. And number two, they don't demand that everyone agree with it, right? That in the Soviet Union and in, Cold War communism, really existing communism, there was a demand that everyone believe in communism. Everyone believe in the Marxist-Leninist ideology. Everybody. And if you don't believe in it, you're a traitor to the country, etc. So everyone had to kind of pretend to believe in it. Well, that doesn't work. People don't like having ideas imposed on them, right? Well, now, if you go to China, there's not a demand that everyone in China believe in communism. It is the ruling ideology, etc. But if you want to believe in it and you want to be, study Marxism, they have places you can do that. And the Communist Party studies it, but there's not a demand that everyone believe in it. And there is public debate about policy. So, really existing socialism was very authoritarian, and that authoritarianism was a strength in a way, but it turned into a weakness. And part of the reason it turned into a weakness was because of the information revolution. Information was much more accessible. All right. Thoughts on Arthur Miller, author of The Crucible and the Death of a Salesman? All righty. Very good. Okay, 1929 and 2008. The next question we got here is 1929 and 2008. How did the trade unions hold up, in your opinion? Those are two interesting dates, right? I guess those are two times where there was a big economic crisis in the country. And you're asking, how did the trade unions hold up? Well, 1929, you had the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And the AFL at that point was in an anti-communist frenzy. And then you had the Communist Party that had just formed the Trade Union Unity League, the TUUL, which was like their alternative to the American Federation of Labor, which was very radical. 1928, you had a big strike in Gastonia, North Carolina, among the textile workers that had been led by the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was trying to organize the South. They were emphasizing on organizing the South, I believe, where there were no labor unions. And the American Federation of Labor was in an anti-communist frenzy. And then the U.S. economy crashed. The Communist Party started their unemployment council thing. That was 1929. 2008, I was politically active in 2008. I mean, I remember that. And right after Obama won the 2008 presidential election, that winter, there was something called the Republic Windows and Door Makers Strike. I don't know if people remember that, but United Electrical Workers, UE, which is a more radical labor union, they had a factory in Chicago that made doors and windows, and the workers there were going to lose their jobs because of the financial crisis. So they occupied their factories. And me and my college roommate, we got up and we drove all night to Chicago to support the Republic Windows and Door Makers. And there's like, in Capitalism, a Love Story, you can see one of my roommates, holding a picket sign and, his breath coming out of his mouth because it was freezing cold there. The Republic Window and Door Makers of Chicago had a sit-down strike, and they occupied their factory. And and that happened, and it was a sit-down strike, and there was a hope that there might be a sit-down strike wave, but it didn't happen. Right. But there was, the UE, which is a historically communist, now more DSA-ish, but slightly more radical labor union, UE. The UE, they did the Republican Window and Door Makers strike. And then like a year later, I remember in response that the Tea Party came. There was the Tea Party that was pushing for austerity, pushing libertarian analysis. So then there was a big rally in Washington, D.C., against the Tea Party that was called by the labor unions. And it was called One Nation, like the One Nation March. And it was like all these labor unions gathered in Washington, D.C. to have a pro-labor union protest in Washington, D.C. It was kind of lame. I will say that the labor unions, especially a couple years after that, like we're talking like 2013, 2014, they started talking a much more radical game. They started talking about low-wage workers and, the fast food forward campaign and all of that. But it didn't translate into any actual organizing. I mean, it didn't translate into actually unionizing any sectors. They're not trying to unionize Walmart. They're not trying to, the Amazon struggle is going on, thank goodness. But at that point, they weren't trying to unionize Amazon. And, the labor bureaucracy, they started talking a much more radical game, and they were talking a much more radical game because they were basically more or less, it was like to make up for what they weren't doing. It was very, very weird. They had AFL-CIO had this convention where they were like, it sounded very, very left-wing and radical, the way they were talking at that convention. And that was a few years afterwards. So, the labor union's response to the crisis, one thing that I actually did appreciate, I'll see if I can find it. I don't like Obama, obviously. I didn't vote for Obama. I voted for the Green Party in 2008. I voted for Cynthia McKinney. And I also like, I'm not, he was a bad president, but I also don't like racism. And Richard Trumka became the head of the AFL-CIO during these years, Richard Trumka. And Richard Trumka was he was a miners union organizer from West Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. And Trumka actually gave a very good speech against racism, urging white workers who were racist against Obama not to be racist. And I actually appreciated that speech. If you listen to the speech, he says, he talks about, that was a decent speech, honestly. And, it was good. He was basically saying, shouldn't you be more concerned about the future of your country? Shouldn't you be more concerned about economics than whether or not the president's black? And, he basically was urging, white workers like him, he's a coal miner from West Virginia, to reject racism. I thought that was pretty neat. It was a pretty good speech, and it was class solidarity. It wasn't about white privilege. It was, as DNB says, racism divides the working class. Obama is obviously better than McCain. He's more pro-labor union, and you should put aside your bigotry and vote in your class interest and put your bigotry aside. And, it was a pretty decent speech. I remember that. That was in 2008. Richard Trumka gave a pretty decent speech urging people to put their racism aside and vote for Obama, and then again, that's before wokeism got the upper hand, right? I mean, things, the first couple of years of Obama, there was still like a feeling that regular leftism might work, right? And that they might allow like regular leftism to happen. Michael Moore, he made that movie Capitalism, a Love Story, which my former roommate was in for like 2 seconds. And, and then, the labor unions had their big rally in Washington, D.C., and that there was a feeling that maybe the left would be allowed to exist. By the end of Obama's presidency, it became very clear that the left was not going to be allowed to exist. The cancel culture, the wokeness had taken over completely. But it hadn't completely taken over yet. What's interesting is a lot of that woke crap started in the labor union bureaucracy, which is weird because labor union members, are working class people. They're not, into the woke stuff. But a lot of people who worked for labor unions, they'd go to this like training that the labor union leaders would put on, and they would do all the woke crap with them. Right. And I was in communist groups, and there'd be people in communist groups. They'd get a job in the labor unions, and they would go to like labor union bureaucrat training camp, and they would learn all this woke crap. And then they would come out of it and they would bring it into the communist groups. Right. And by the time Obama was leaving office, wokeism had become dominant. Wokeism had dominance, and it destroyed, the leftist groups for the most part. So there you go. There you go. Next super chat question. And anyone else, if you got super chats, bring them on, because I'm on here to answer your questions. Any other stories of old timers during McCarthyism? Oh, sure. There was a woman that I sat in her living room, and she showed us the photo album. And she had been a member of the Socialist Workers Party, and she had protested when they fired all the Communist Party members at a steel plant in Buffalo, and the FBI had come to her job, and she'd lost her job. And she'd gotten another job. She'd been a teacher, and the FBI had come, and she'd lost her job as a teacher. And then she worked at another place. The FBI showed up again, so she ended up having to work at a phone company, because the FBI wouldn't allow her to be a teacher. Basically, every time she got a teaching job, the FBI would show up and say, she's a commie. She can't work here. Another story that I heard, and this is wild, right, is that if in all the public libraries in the country, in the major cities at least, maybe they didn't do this in rural areas, in all the public libraries, if you wanted to read books about communism, they kept them behind the counter. They had like special books that were restricted or regulated. And if you wanted to read books by Marx or Lenin or Stalin or stuff like that, you could go to the counter and ask for them, but you had to show ID, and they would write your name down. And it was not uncommon that if you checked out too many books from the restricted section, you might get a knock on your door from the FBI, and they might say, why are you reading all these subversive books? Are you tied in with any organizations? That was like intimidation, right? That happened in the 50s, right? Is that if you had books about communism or whatever, you would be, basically there was an effort to keep people from reading about Marxism and intimidating people. And they had like a restricted section. Nelson Peary talks about that in his autobiography, and older communists talked about that as well. And how one thing they would do is that they would, people would have libraries in their homes, and that people would have people come over to their house to read the books, because it wasn't safe to check out the books from the public library, because the FBI would then track you. What other stories did I hear? One of the worst stories I ever heard was there was a woman who was a leader of the California Communist Party. And they had arrested another leader of the Communist Party or whatever for subversive activity, trying to overthrow the government or whatever. So they put her on the witness stand, and they asked her, is this woman a member of the Communist Party? And she said, I refuse to answer that question. And the judge said, all right, that's 1 year in jail for contempt of court. And so then the prosecutor pulled out a list of every person who was, they thought was a member of the Communist Party. He said, is Joe Bob a member of the Communist Party? She said, I refuse to answer. Another year in prison. Is Ann Smith a member of the Communist Party? She said, no, another year in prison. And by the time this woman had left the courtroom, she had racked up like 200 years in prison, because they just read off name after name after name of person. Is this person in the party? And she would say, I'm not going to answer that question. And she refused to turn in her comrades. Now ultimately an appeals court overturned that and said, you can't do that. You can't do that. Right. But a judge was giving her a year in prison for every name she refused to give. Every person she refused to confirm whether they were a member of the Communist Party. He'd say, that's a year. That's another year. That's another year. And, stuff like that went on. Another thing, and this is wild, and I don't know Adam Curtis. I don't know his work, Kinky. I apologize. I just don't know his work. This is a thing that happened during McCarthyism that's interesting. Is that they made a law during McCarthyism that if you went before the House Un-American Activities Committee, you had to either answer all the questions or none of them. Right? And all of them or none of them. And that was the way they worked, right? So, they would bring you up there. You were required to give your name and your home address. And then if you took the Fifth Amendment, you had to take the Fifth Amendment for every question, right? So, it wasn't like you could answer some of them and not all of them. They changed it so either you answer all the questions or none of them, right? If you invoke the Fifth Amendment, then you can't answer any of these questions, right? So, one trick they used to do, and this is so unbelievable, right? It just shows how evil these people are. These people would get up there and they'd say, all right, are you a member of the Communist Party? They'd say, I invoke the Fifth Amendment. And they say, now you have to invoke the Fifth Amendment for all future questions. You understand that? Yes. And then they would start asking them, are you planning to blow up a bridge here? Are you planning to assassinate the president? Invokes Fifth Amendment. Are you planning to blow up a bridge? Are you planning to kill people? And they would accuse them of all kinds of crimes, and they would have to take the Fifth Amendment. They couldn't answer the question, right? They couldn't say no, right? They were then obligated. They couldn't answer the question. So then in the newspapers the next day, it would say Communist Party leader refuses to answer whether or not he's planning to blow up a bridge or planning to kill the president. It was really nasty what they would do. And it would be all over the newspapers. They asked that leader of the Communist Party if he was planning to kill the president. He wouldn't answer the question. Well, he couldn't, right? They wouldn't include that. They wouldn't say, well, he wasn't allowed to, but they would just use that for propaganda, right? And it'd be all over the news that this communist wanted to kill the president, and they would do that. Really nasty, nasty thing to do. I'm trying to think of other stories I know about McCarthyism, right? It was just awful. McCarthyism, I mean, the more you read about it. And the big thing is that everyone thinks McCarthyism was just movie stars, right? They think it was all just movie stars. They think it was Hollywood actors. This is my favorite. I almost want to slap these people whenever I hear this, but it's like whenever I would hear people talk about McCarthyism, they'd say, yeah, there were some good people who got in trouble too. I always hear that, right? Oh, there was some actor and he just went to a meeting. He went to a peace club meeting and then he got his whole career destroyed by House of Un-American activities. Like if he was a communist, it would be okay to destroy his career and throw him in jail. But, there was just this good actor, this wholesome Hollywood actor who just went to a peace meeting, right? But that's half the story. That's half the story, right? It's not just that he went to a peace meeting. If you went to a peace meeting or whatever, all you had to do is get up and apologize for doing it and then list a bunch of names of other people, and then you got off the hook. That's the way it worked. And there were a lot of Hollywood actors who did that. Oh, you went to this peace meeting? Sure. And then you'd get up and you'd say, wow, I am so sorry I went to this peace meeting. I would never go to a peace meeting again. And here's the names of 15 other people that went to this peace meeting with me. And then they would leave you alone, right? And that's how McCarthyism tended to work, right? As long as you named names and apologized for in being a dissident, they would let you go. But the thing was, there were a lot of people who said, wait a second, hold up. What's wrong with going to a peace meeting? What if I want to be in the Communist Party? I have that right. That's my freedom, right? And no, I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to rat out the other people who went to this meeting. No, I'm not going to do that. And so those people, they would jail them for contempt or they would blacklist them and destroy their careers. But it wasn't just Hollywood actors. It was all kinds of people. I mean, government employees and, there's many, many people that were affected by this. I mean, it was pretty bad. I mean, one thing that people don't talk about McCarthyism that I'm sure a lot of the viewers know about because you guys are sophisticated is that in 1951, they passed a law to create concentration camps. Did you know this? The McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951 created a network of concentration camps to put Americans in. And it had the U.S. Department of Justice assemble a list of 2 million people that would be put in concentration camps amid a national emergency. Right? Can you believe that? They had a law that they created to create concentration camps. And they had a list of 2 million people who would go to concentration camps in a state of national emergency. That's pretty fascistic. There was the famous Peekskill riot, where, the Communist Party and their friends, they had a concert in upstate New York, in Peekskill, New York. They had a concert where Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger performed. And the Ku Klux Klan and the American Legion, they assembled to oppose the concert. And the Communist Party, they circled it and they defended it. But then, the police forced them to drive through the mob. Like the police directed traffic. So as they were leaving the concert, they had to drive through the mob, and all the people were like throwing bricks at them and smashing their car windows and stuff as they were driving through. That was an incident that happened. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of bad time. McCarthyism was a very bad time. And that, unfortunately, the trauma of McCarthyism, that's the basis for this feeling among, a lot of the anti-populism of the synthetic left, right? I mean, a lot of the belief that average Americans are the enemy, stuff like that, comes out of this trauma of McCarthyism. It's like, well, at least the left will not take away our democratic rights. At least the left will allow us to exist. That was kind of the feeling, right? That anyone's better than the right wing. They're McCarthyists. So there you go. Can one be a capitalist and anti-imperialist at the same time? If not, what do you think Putin's real politics are? Writing it down. Can one be a capitalist and an anti-imperialist at the same time? What do you think Putin's real politics are? Okay. Next question. We got Betrayal of the Greek Communists, book on the subjects. Well, what are you referring to? Are you referring to the Greek Civil War? Or are you referring to the Greek Communist Party selling out and accusing Russia of imperialism and stuff? Because, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform and Joe T. Brar and other people have spoken up about the Greek communists and how they're betraying the need for an anti-imperialist movement now. Or are you talking about the Greek Civil War, right? A lot of people feel the Soviet Union betrayed Greece during the Greek Civil War. There could have been a socialist revolution in Greece, but the Soviet Union betrayed it or whatever. I don't know. I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Next question. Thoughts on Arthur Miller, author of The Crucible and Death of the Salesman? Well, I read After the Fall. I've seen The Crucible, as a play. I've read it as a book. I've seen the movie. It's a good play about mass hysteria and, with you or against you or whatever. I think it's an important work, of fiction. It's using the Salem witch trials as an analogy for McCarthyism. Okay. It's an analogy for using McCarthyism as an analogy, or using the Salem witch trials as an analogy for McCarthyism, right? The Salem witch trials, you actually look at the details, it's a little weird, right? So it started with a slave woman named Tituba, right? And she was a slave woman, and she was from Barbados, and she was a slave. And she was teaching these young girls, teenage girls, she was teaching them stories and stuff that she had learned. Right. She was kind of teaching them voodoo, basically. She was teaching them some of the myths and legends of African people in Barbados. And she was telling stories and I don't know. I mean, she was telling them mythological stories or something. And that wasn't allowed in Puritan times, I think. Right. And so there was kind of a secret meeting. These teenage girls would gather and they would listen to Tituba, and Tituba would tell them about, pagan beliefs or whatever. And they all knew you weren't supposed to do that. Puritan times, very, very deeply religious. People were afraid of going to hell. They thought it was very evil and all of that. And all these girls, they had a huge amount of guilt about having done it. And so some of them started, they were, I don't know, they were getting together. They were listening to Tituba. She was teaching them African religion or voodoo or Santeria or something. And she was telling them stories and she was entertaining them. She was doing that. And so some of the girls felt really guilty about it. And so they started they were having, what they later called hysteria, right? They were acting crazy. They were hallucinating, or they were feeling guilty, right? They'd grown up in this society. Anything that's not Christian, you will go straight to hell. This is the most evil thing in the world. And they were doing this and they started feeling guilty about it. And they were kind of blackmailing each other or whatever. And so after a little while, they'd had this secret witchcraft club or secret African medicine club or whatever. Some of them started, I don't know, they started hallucinating or hearing voices or having like little baby temper tantrums where they'd like start crying and in the middle of church and start rolling around on the floor or something. It was, they were emotionally upset because they were doing something they weren't supposed to do, right? In the Puritan society, you weren't supposed to do that. They knew it was against the rules. They were doing it anyway. They felt guilty. They were blackmailing each other. Like, they didn't want to tell on each other. And one thing happened to another. And so these girls were having psychological issues because they were breaking the rules. And then, so then, they decided, oh, this is witchcraft. They brought in some witchcraft experts, and then the witchcraft experts were like, it became a case of, what did they call it? It became a case of, they were all in huge trouble for doing that. They were all in huge trouble for doing that, right? And so it was a case of, there were some people who it was, economically in their interest. They wanted to get all the farms to accuse a bunch of people of having been in on it. And these girls were in huge trouble because they've been doing this. So then it became like, okay, well, you can accuse all the right people, or we can just punish you for doing this. And so in order to save themselves, they basically had to start accusing whoever the people in the town wanted to be accused. And that was the thing. And, when you were accused, you could confess and then name other people. And if you didn't do that, then they would hang you. And that was the Salem witch trials, a horrendous moment in American history, right? I mean, it was awful. I mean, it was just, and it was an episode of mass hysteria, and it was an episode of like where you're guilty until proven innocent. You're not allowed to defend yourself. The evidence of guilt is very nefarious. The fact that you would think the court could accuse you wrongly is evidence of guilt, right? I mean, you're on trial for thought crime, right? And the fact that, the attitude was basically at the Salem witch trials was that this great court is here trying to solve the problem of witchcraft. They've accused you of witchcraft, and you're saying that this court is lying. So clearly you must be a witch, because why would you go against this court? I think there's a line in the play by Arthur Miller. He says, you're with this court or against this court. But, Arthur Miller wrote that play. Arthur Miller was accused of being a communist. I don't know if he had, I think he had friends who were, he's from New York City, Jewish family in New York City in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. The Communist Party was a big deal in New York City at that time among those neighborhoods and communities. And so it's probably likely he knew somebody or something, but, I don't think he was ever a member of the Communist Party. But, I also, though, Death of a Salesman. I watched the movie of that recently. I had read The Death of a Salesman, right? And The Death of a Salesman is a completely different play, right? The Crucible is about, the Salem witch trials, guilt by association, guilt by suspicion, guilty until proven innocent, etc. The Death of a Salesman, right? That is about, a salesman, basically, and his relationship with his sons. And he's kind of a slimy salesman, basically. And he's a slimy salesman who, I don't know. It's like he's a slimy salesman, and he represents kind of this hopeful American ideal, the American dream. You can get anything you want if you just work hard enough. But he gradually just starts burning bridges, and that he doesn't really treat his wife very nicely. He doesn't really love his two sons. And it's about, this man who's supposed to be the American dream, this high income American salesman who's actually kind of he's hurt his wife and kids, and eventually he dies and nobody misses him. Right. I mean, I think at the end of the play, the wife says something like, his name is Willie Loman. Right. And then it's like the thing is they pick the name, like Willie is like a kid's name. Right. And then Loman, it's like, he's a low man. Like he's not a high achiever. He's not a good person. He's like low. Right. And the idea is when he dies, like towards the end of the play, after he dies, the wife says, Willie, I want to mourn for you, but sometimes I feel like you're just on one of your long trips. I don't even feel like I really lost you. and that his two sons both kind of had problems because their dad was like obsessed with money and wasn't there for them or something. It's been a long time since I've read it, but yeah, it's about right, and like it's about this salesman, his relationship with his two sons and his wife, and how he eventually dies. And yeah, his name is Willie Loman, and he represents kind of that that American dream, that optimism, that stupid optimism. Is that glass half empty or is it half full? You can do anything you want if you just try hard enough. And it's supposed to represent the the American dream kind of being full of holes, which is a big theme in a lot of theater, right? I think Eugene O'Neill, The Iceman Cometh. That's about a salesman who, like, he's in a bar and he rips apart everyone's pipe dreams. And, and if you read, what's it called? The Great Gatsby. That's a similar thing, right? It's a big theme in like 20th century literature. You get a lot of people saying the American dream ain't cracked up to be what it's supposed to be. And like, what does this mean? That the American dream is gone, and what do we do? What's the point of life if, America's supposed to be this great country where anyone can just get ahead and make a lot of money, but clearly it's not that. And, broken dreams, etc. There's Long Day's Journey into Night is it Eugene O'Neill who wrote that? Long Day's Journey into Night, which is actually quite a good play. I actually enjoyed of all the plays like this, Long Day's Journey into Night. Is that Eugene O'Neill? I really enjoyed Long Day's Journey into Night. Yes, it is Eugene O'Neill, Long Day's Journey into Night, right? Yeah. And Long Day's Journey into Night, it's like the son comes home, right? And the mother and father have been married for years, and the two sons have come home, and the mother is having a heroin addiction relapse or a morphine addiction relapse, right? And that she got addicted to heroin or to morphine. And the reason she got addicted to morphine was because the father was cheap and he didn't take her to a good doctor when she was sick. He took her to a bad doctor that gave her pain pills instead of the treatment she needed. And then the father was an actor, but he played the same role over and over and over again for years. And he could have been a better actor, but he wasn't willing to take the risk, right? And so he played the same role because he wanted the job security. He played the same role for years. And the son is disappointed in the father. And he says, why couldn't you spend more money to take care of mom? And why couldn't you take the risk of getting a better play part? Why did you play the same role for year after year after year? Right. And that is Eugene O'Neill. It's The Great Gatsby. That's F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is American literature. That's like 20th century American literature. There's a lot of this, right? And so that's what The Death of a Salesman is about. So there you go. Alrighty. I think, never mind. Anyway, can one be a capitalist and an anti-imperialist at the same time? And what do you think Putin's real politics are? Well, those are two separate questions. First of all, can one be a capitalist and an anti-imperialist at the same time? Of course you can. Imperialism is an economic system, right? It's global monopoly capitalism. It's capitalism in its monopoly stage. And there are many capitalists who are not in it, right? I mean, the goal of imperialism is to put all the capitalists in the third world out of business so that Western capitalism has a monopoly. And yes, there are many capitalists in the third world that would like to make money and not be crushed by the imperialists. Many of them, right? Imperialism is not in the interest, I would say, of the majority of the capitalists in the world. Imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage. That's what imperialism is. And so, yeah, one can be an owner of means of production. One can be a capitalist and an imperialist and an anti-imperialist. However, I would argue that for a country to secure its position and break out of imperialism, it must exert control over the means of production. There can be a market sector there. But if a country breaks out of Western capitalism, the only way they can maintain their independent economy is to assert state control over it, right? And that's something that we've learned. And that Che Guevara, he wrote that the petty bourgeoisie, or the bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie of the third world is too weak. It must have the working class on their side in order to defeat the imperialists. And that is correct. And that most anti-imperialist struggles start out with the national bourgeoisie going up against the imperialists, the national capitalists, but then they bring the working class into motion. And eventually the working class becomes the dominant force in the movement of national liberation. And eventually the struggle against imperialism leads to socialism. But, in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, when he started out, he said he was neither a capitalist or a socialist. He would just do what was best for Venezuela. But he was backed by Venezuela's national capitalists, national bourgeoisie. They were getting crushed by the American imperialists. And then Hugo Chavez got elected on a platform of opposing neoliberalism, which was putting all the Venezuelan capitalists out of business. However, then there was a coup against Hugo Chavez. And then the rank and file soldiers rose up, and Chavez realized the only way he could stay in power was to mobilize the working class to have his back. And eventually, the capitalists who were supporting him, a lot of them jumped ship and stopped supporting him because the working class was so essential that pretty soon Bolivarianism became a vehicle for establishing working class power. And that often happens, that it starts out with the national capitalists fighting the imperialists, but then they have to recruit the workers to be on their side. And because of that, the workers become active. And pretty soon, the struggle of a national capitalist or a national bourgeoisie against imperialism leads to socialism. The Chinese Revolution is that, right? The KMT nationalist movement in China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, there was a lot of millionaires and capitalists that supported him. They didn't care about socialism, but they wanted to have a strong economy in China so they could make money. But in order to do that, they had to mobilize the Chinese working class and the Chinese peasantry to fight for them against the imperialists. And one thing led to another, and eventually you had the Chinese Communist Party taking over and becoming the leaders, leading the bloc of four great classes against imperialism. So yeah, the idea that one can either be an advocate of capitalism or one can be a genuine capitalist, like an owner of means of production, and be an anti-imperialist, of course. However, the fight against imperialism necessitates moving towards socialism eventually. But there are, in 21st century socialism, there are capitalists. They just don't have the power. And that's the important thing you have to remember. In 21st century socialism, there are private companies, but they don't have control. The state, the revolutionary government of the working class, has control of society. But there's a market sector, right? And those capitalists exist, and they are enabled to do their thing as part of an overall central plan where a working class revolutionary government controls the economy, right? And that there are capitalists that are part of socialist societies nowadays. Vietnam, China, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they have lots of capitalists there, but they are forced to work in the interests of the overall socialist program put forward by the government. And that you need this now. You need a market sector in this time, I argue. So yeah, and the next question, it was part of the same from Kinky. She asked, what does Putin actually believe? Well, I've never met him privately. I've been in the same room as him a few times, but when I listen to Putin, I hear a lot of different things. Right? I hear pride in the history of the Soviet Union and their defeat of the Nazis. I hear pride in Russia and the history of Russia as a country. I hear anger at what Russia suffered during the fall of the Soviet Union. I hear a very strategic, intelligent man who knows how to deal with the Western capitalists and also knows how to manage the economy, and wrote a college thesis about how to use public ownership of oil and gas to stabilize the economy of Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and rescue it from the disaster of Yeltsin. When I hear Putin talk, I hear a lot of different things. Modern Russia is an amalgamation of different forces, right? I hear the Orthodox Church. He's a Christian. He has very much Orthodox beliefs. I hear the Orthodox Church and their beliefs when I hear Putin talk. Putin's beliefs are a mishmash, and modern Russia is a mishmash. There's a lot of different influences there. There's the Russian Orthodox tradition. There's Russian nationalism. There's the experience of the Soviet Union, the pride in the Soviet Union's achievements. It's a lot of different things. And, when I hear Putin talk, I think he wants what is in the interest of Russia, and he's open to different schools of thought that will achieve his end of making a peaceful, more prosperous Russia. That's what I see when I listen to Putin talk. That's what I hear. So there you go. All right. Putin signing a $1.7 billion spending bill. I think that's their annual budget they just signed. Huge amount of money for the military, more money for Ukraine. It wasn't enough to give them all the billions we already gave them. They had to have this stupid rally in Washington, D.C. and give them more money. So ridiculous. And the American people are suffering, and the American people have been left behind. And the Wall Street bankers just keep getting richer and richer and richer. Not good. Not good. Not pleased with it. And thank you for asking, David Fox, but I'm not pleased. There's so many parts of America that are falling apart. So many working class communities that have been devastated. And they're spending lots of money, but that money is not going to improve America. I'll tell you that much. That money is being handed out to their cronies. That money has been used to continue the war machine and get the war machine all revved up. That money's going to the Nazis in Kiev and prolonging the conflict with Russia. So yeah, I mean, the Biden administration has been a total failure. Biden said a lot of great stuff. He said a lot of great stuff in his first joint address, but he didn't mean any of it. And they all say that. Trump said it too. Oh, we're going to rebuild the infrastructure of the country, but they don't do it, right? They all know that the economy, the infrastructure of the USA is a mess, but they don't want to fix it. Their priority is serving the bankers, not fixing the economy of the United States. They know that's what everyone wants to hear. Everyone wants to hear, oh, we're going to rebuild the bridges and highways. But they don't do it. They don't do it because, the people that they're working for, the oligarchy that they work for, the big banks and monopolists, that's not a priority for them. So there you go. There you go. All right, folks. Yeah, I guess I'm 35 years old now. So there you go. I'll probably be back tomorrow night. I'm going to go out with some friends earlier in the day, but I'll probably be back tomorrow night for another stream. And onward to the next year, right? I'm just going to keep streaming as much as I possibly can. I'm working on my new book that should be out by our March event. I'm working on that book. I worked on it some today. That book is coming along. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. So let's show this closing video that Robert made for us a while back. Let's do it. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.